Okay, so today we're going to have a quick look at using a Golang Lambda to connect to a Redshift database. There's nothing too complicated here before, but I am assuming that you've got a lot of these resources in place already. So I've previously written a blog post and a video on deploying a Golang Lambda. So that just gives us a way to deploy your Golang code into a Lambda and invoke it. And then second up, we've got assumes that you've launched a Redshift cluster. In my case, I did a video on launching it using Terraform, which is a nice way to launch Terraform and destroy it again afterwards. Now, or create your Redshift cluster and destroy it afterwards. Redshift itself is very expensive, even if you're just playing about with it. It's a good idea that if you don't plan on keeping it alive, killing it off, because it can cost hundreds of dollars a month. But if you use this, then make sure you destroy it afterwards so you're not getting billed for it. Okay, and as I said, we're just building this Lambda, connecting it to Redshift. So your AWS account, if you follow those instructions, should look a little bit like this. You should have your blog, Hello World Example Lambda. If you go in here, you can just click on test, invoke it, and it just prints out Hello World from Golang Lambda. It's not doing anything yet. You should then have a secrets manager entry that's being created by Terraform. This just contains your username, your password for your database. We're going to need that later. And then lastly, obviously your Redshift cluster that we're going to connect to. So the first thing we're going to do is have a look at the code that we're using. So we're going to use this make file that we talked about before for deploying it. All it does is make deploy, builds it, zips it up, uploads it to our Lambda so that we can iterate through it and make changes. We've got our Golang file. All it does at the moment is print out Hello World from Golang Lambda, as we've seen. And then we've got this Terraform script. We're not going to use this again, but this is just what I've used before to make that cluster, so I can destroy it again later. So now if we go to our blog post that we're following from, the links for all these will be in the description. And so the Golang Redshift example blog post, there's two ways to connect. The first is using like a standard Postgres library. That's what we're going to do today. The second way is using that Redshift data API. But again, we're just going to focus on the first way. So we copy and paste this code, place it into our code editor, click save. And now we can do our, so we've got two directories, one for Lambda, one for Terraform. Go into our Lambda directory. We see here, we've got our files and we can just do our make deploy. If you're running this for the first time, there's a good chance that you don't have that Postgres library installed. I think it's something like go get github.com/lib/pq. It'll suggest the command for you. You might just need to run that. Okay, and that's it deployed by running make deploy, but we're actually going to have to make some changes first of all. So as I said, we've got this github.com library Postgres, so just a standard sort of Postgres library within the Golang ecosystem. And we're going to connect to Postgres. Now, in this case, we're going to use hard-coded credentials. I want less moving parts when you're learning this, but in the real world, you wouldn't use this. You would use Secrets Manager to pull it down. If you do want to go down that route, all you'd have to go to is your Secrets Manager, scroll down to the bottom, and they actually give you these handy snippets already, which you can almost copy and paste and tweak a little bit into your Lambda and start using it. You might need to play about with permissions a little bit, but for the most part, it's a nice snippet. But for us, what we're going to do is we're going to take our username, replace that user with it. Then we're going to take our password. We're going to get our cluster information, including the port number, and replace that here. And now, I didn't call my database. I created in Terraform, so my database is called MyDB. So this is a very quick and dirty way to connect to the database. Again, ideally you'd want to use Secrets Manager and pull in these secrets, especially that password, which is definitely not secure in the slightest. But for now, less moving parts, let's just get the job done. Okay, and so now we want to go ahead and redeploy that. Okay, so that's it deployed. So now if we go into our Lambda and click test again, what we're going to notice here though is going to keep spinning. Our Lambda execution is set for 15 seconds before it times out, and because it can't connect to the database yet, it's not allowed to access the database. It's going to go the full 15 seconds and eventually time out. This is because the security group hasn't been configured. So we'll need to go into Redshift, click on the properties, and you can see here we've got this VPC security group. Now there's a few options here. The quick and dirty way would be to go in here, add in a new inbound rule to our security group that would allow port 5439 to access it. But as you can see here, this rule basically says all traffic's allowed if it's from this security group, which is the security group ID. So it can always communicate by itself. So what we could do is, rather than open up ports, is just apply the same security group to the Lambda, and the Lambda and Redshift are going to be allowed to communicate with each other without worrying about sort of like allowing outside traffic getting into this. So we go back to our Lambda, go into configuration, and go down to the VPC tab, click on edit. So we're going to select it. I don't have many options to pick from, but you want this to be the same VPC as your Redshift cluster. I'm going to pick a couple of subnets. A lot of the time you'd want this to be in a private subnet. For the sake of this demo, we're going to put it in a public subnet, so we don't need to worry about like any outbound access getting restricted or anything like that. And because then you have to start worrying about endpoints or NAT gateways. But for now, we're going to keep it in a public subnet. We're going to select that same security group. So we go back into Redshift, copy that security group ID, and there we go. So now that security group has all access to that security group, which means that if the Lambda and Redshift are both sharing it, they can communicate with each other. Now, we're going to get another error message here, because the Lambda doesn't have permission to go into a VPC yet. So if we go back, open this in a new tab so we don't lose all our hard work there. If we go into configuration, permissions. So the role of the Lambda was created, so blog hello world example role, that's the name of my one. We're going to go in. And these are just the permissions. This is what your Lambda is allowed to do. So it's not allowed to do very much by default other than this basic execution rule. So we want to attach another one, which I forget the name of, but I think it's something like Lambda VPC. There it is. AWS Lambda VPC access execution rule. So we'll attach that. We'll need to wait a few seconds for it to apply, but this will allow us to go back and attach our Lambda to that same VPC. Okay, now this part will take a few minutes to do, so we'll just need to wait patiently. I'll just skip ahead. Okay, so this is back, and after a few minutes, it's now been successfully updated. It's now attached to that VPC. It's got the right security group. So if we go back into test, we click on test, it should be a lot quicker. And then we should just see a little log saying we're using the Postgres approach to query Redshift, and you'll just get whatever it is we've dumped out. Now to continue this, you want to go in, write some real database queries you want to do, pull the data back and start processing it properly. But hopefully this gives you a good starting point for writing Golang code that can sit in a Lambda and communicate with Redshift. Now there are some limitations to this approach. Because we're using a Lambda, it's probably got that usual that 15-minute timeout rule, and Redshift by nature is like a petabyte scale storage solution, which means if you're using it, you've probably got a lot of data you want to process, which means your queries are probably going to be quite large, and you might find that 15 minutes isn't always going to be long enough. If that's the case, you'll want to research Redshift data API instead. There's more information on that in the blog post, and I'll address it later in a future video.